The sharp sting of a winter's chill cut through the fog that clung to London's streets. In the dim glow of gas lamps, the buzz of distant carriages and hurried footsteps of pedestrians seemed muffled, as if the city itself were holding its breath. But in the heart of the fog, one event shattered the quiet. A man had been found dead in the center of Paddington Station. His body, rigid with the unmistakable tension of a sudden end, lay sprawled across the tracks, his eyes wide with a look of disbelief frozen on his face. The victim was James Varnum, a well-known financier in London's high society, his name etched on the social register of the wealthy elite. He had not been scheduled to board any train, nor had he shown up at any scheduled meeting for the day. The authorities, perplexed, assumed that it was an accident. A man stumbling, losing his balance, and tragically falling to his death. Yet there was something off about the case, something unsettling that nagged at the back of the head constable's mind. James Varnum had been known for his strict aversion to travel by train, his fear of public transport so deep-rooted that no one had ever seen him step onto a railway platform, let alone board a train. His decision to appear at Paddington Station at such a late hour, alone and without prior indication of travel plans, left the police scratching their heads. The case seemed open and shut. An unfortunate accident, possibly a suicide. But the peculiarities began to mount, and soon enough, the authorities were left in no doubt that the case required more than their amateur conclusions could provide. The press, already eager to sink their teeth into any gossip concerning London's wealthiest, began circulating wild theories, and it wasn't long before the police called in an expert. Enter Hercule Poirot. The Belgian detective arrived with his usual punctuality, stepping out of his cab with a precise elegance that immediately set him apart from the chaos of the station. His tall frame moved through the bustle with quiet authority, his mind already at work, dissecting the scene. Poirot's eyes scanned the body of James Varnum, studying every detail with an intensity that might have made anyone in his vicinity feel uncomfortable. "There is more to this than meets the eye," he remarked in his deliberate French accent, his voice calm but carrying the weight of someone accustomed to untangling the most intricate mysteries. He looked at the constable who had initially reported the incident. "Tell me, monsieur, has anyone noticed anything unusual about the body?" Poirot inquired, his eyes narrowing as he examined the lifeless form. The constable scratched his head, unsure of what Poirot was aiming for. "No, sir," the constable replied. "Just what we've been told." It seems straightforward. "Is it?" Poirot's voice dropped slightly. "You said he fell onto the tracks, but did anyone see him fall?" A few moments of silence hung in the air as Poirot's words hung like an accusation, but no one had an immediate answer. Poirot turned his sharp gaze towards the station platform. His mind was already working at full capacity, constructing possibilities, discarding others. One thing was for certain. The case of James Varnum's death would not be as simple as it first appeared. There were layers to this mystery, layers that only Hercule Poirot's little grey cells could unravel, and it was only just beginning. In his mind, Poirot began to formulate the first piece of the puzzle, noting the small clues that others might overlook. Why had Varnum been here at all? Why here, at the exact time the train he would never have boarded was scheduled to depart? Poirot glanced once more at the body and then turned toward the officers. His mind was already working through the complexities of this crime, and in the pit of his stomach, he knew there was something more, something dangerous lurking beneath the surface of this high society man's untimely death. "Now, I will need to gather the suspects," Poirot murmured to himself. "The truth is hidden here somewhere, but it will not reveal itself so easily. There is a game to be played, and I, Hercule Poirot, will be the one to set the rules." As he walked away, every step brought him closer to unraveling the secret behind James Varnum's death, an enigma that could shatter lives, expose hidden passions, and ultimately reveal the face of the murderer. The room where James Varnum had been found dead was still, the harsh clattering of the station's activities now muffled by Poirot's quiet contemplation. His presence, marked by his usual sharpness and attention to detail, became an immediate contrast to the officers who were scrambling to connect the dots of what they had presumed to be a simple, tragic event. Poirot's sharp eyes moved across the room, taking in every detail, the shadow of confusion that hung over the constables, the pile of papers on the desk, the forgotten cup of tea left cold on the counter. The death of a man like Varnum should have created a stir, but there was no sense of chaos, no air of true investigation. There was something off about this. Poirot was convinced that no one was looking in the right direction yet. Gather the suspects. Poirot had instructed the head constable in his quiet, almost commanding manner. He knew there would be few direct answers to this puzzle, but the intricacies of human nature, with all its contradictions, would reveal the truth. He was not wrong. By the time Poirot had returned to the station's private office, a group had assembled, each face telling its own silent story. The first was Eleanor Varnum, the late financier's widow. Her face was as composed as a porcelain mask, her movements controlled with the precision of a woman who knew how to carry herself in society. She was known for her icy demeanor, often seen at the most elegant balls and galas, but today her eyes betrayed a flicker of something deeper. Poirot stepped towards her, his gaze studying her every movement. She shifted her weight slightly, clasping her hands tightly in front of her. He could already tell she was hiding something. Beneath the cool exterior, there was a distinct tension, and Poirot knew her involvement was not yet clear. The second was Charles Montgomery, a business partner of Varnum's. A tall, well-dressed man in his mid-50s, Montgomery had the air of someone used to power, calm but unreadable. He stood near the corner, arms crossed in front of him, eyeing the others with a quiet suspicion. His relationship with Varnum was professional, but Poirot had seen enough to know that professional ties could be frail at best. Lastly, there was Linda Richards, a younger woman with striking beauty and a nervous energy that filled the room. She had been an acquaintance of the Varnums, but what truly drew Poirot's attention was the fact that she had been romantically linked to the late financier in the months leading up to his death. Her eyes darted around the room as though searching for something, an escape perhaps, from the mounting suspicion surrounding her. Poirot, ever the observer, quietly nodded as each suspect entered the room. It was important to him to make no immediate judgments, no sweeping conclusions just yet. Each person had a history with James Varnum, and he needed to untangle their lives in relation to the events that had led to his death. He started with Mrs. Varnum. "Madame, I must ask, what were you doing at the time your husband was discovered? You were not at home, I presume." Her eyes flickered for only a brief moment, betraying a hesitation Poirot would not miss. "I was at the estate, of course. I had some business to attend to." "Ah, business, I see," Poirot replied, his voice carrying the weight of meaning. "How strange that your husband, who so despised trains, would find himself at Paddington Station at such an hour." Eleanor's face remained composed, but Poirot caught the subtle shift in her posture. He did not like trains. He never traveled by them, but there must be some mistake, she said, her words tight but controlled. Poirot then shifted his gaze toward Charles Montgomery, who had been standing in the background, his arms still folded across his chest. The businessman's expression was unreadable, but Poirot knew that the way he refused to engage directly told him more than words could. "And you, Monsieur Montgomery?" Poirot asked with deliberate slowness. "How do you explain your presence in this tangled affair? Surely you have nothing to hide." Montgomery's mouth tightened, and he shifted his weight slightly, clearly uncomfortable under Poirot's scrutiny. "I had business with Varnum. We were discussing the merger, nothing more. The timing of his death. It was unexpected." Poirot leaned slightly forward, his gaze never leaving Montgomery's face. And how do you feel about Varnum's reluctance to take the train, Monsieur Montgomery? Did you know he would never board one? Or is that a detail you prefer to overlook?" For the first time, Montgomery faltered, his mouth opening as if he were about to speak, but then closing again. The silence between them grew thick. Poirot's sharp eyes turned now to the last suspect, Linda Richards. She had been standing quietly, eyes lowered, but she looked up as Poirot's gaze met hers. "Mademoiselle Richard," Poirot began, his tone changing slightly. "I must ask you about your relationship with the late James Varnum. What was your involvement with him, and how is it that you were not at his side at such a time of tragedy?" Linda hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. I didn't know he was in danger. We weren't—" "I don't know what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot gave her a long, measuring look. There was a certain defensiveness in her voice, a hint of a lie buried deep beneath the surface. She was clearly more involved than she let on. The tension in the room was palpable. Each suspect had their own story, their own version of events. But Poirot could already feel the threads beginning to weave together, and though the picture was still incomplete, the truth was beginning to take shape. He stood tall, his voice breaking the silence. "Now, we must proceed with caution. Each of you has a secret, and secrets are what drive men to murder. But as always, it is the smallest of clues, the ones others overlook, that will reveal the truth." The investigation had begun in earnest. The suspects, each with their own motives, hidden agendas, and personal stakes, sat before Hercule Poirot. The air was thick with tension, but Poirot's mind was already at work, analyzing every word, every gesture, and every slight inconsistency. First, he turned his attention back to Eleanor Varnum, who had been seated rigidly, her eyes cold and unyielding. He needed to understand her better. His approach was subtle, a mere suggestion of interest that would allow her to reveal what she believed to be important. His tone remained calm, but underneath it carried a weight of expectation that made her uneasy. "Madame Varnum," Poirot began, his voice soft but insistent. "You mentioned that you had business to attend to when your husband met his fate at the station. Might I inquire as to what this business entailed? Surely such a busy man as your husband would require you to be by his side at such a time." Eleanor Varnum stiffened slightly, but only for a moment. She had learned long ago how to conceal her emotions. "It was business," she repeated. "Nothing more. I had meetings with our lawyers regarding the estate, the usual affairs." Her eyes darted briefly to the door as though she were checking if anyone could overhear. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on her, piercing through the practiced calm she wore. "Of course," he said, his voice laced with just enough curiosity to keep her talking. "How curious that you should leave your husband in such a moment, madame. Surely you would not leave him alone, especially considering his history with travel. Was there no indication that he might be embarking on a journey, perhaps to meet someone or to take an appointment?" Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't used to being probed so directly. "James," she said after a moment, her voice faltering slightly, "was an unusual man. He had his fears, trains especially. He would never have gone near one. It wasn't his style." Poirot nodded as if absorbing the information, but inside he was already at work. Eleanor's statement only deepened the mystery. If her husband had such a deep aversion to trains, why would he have been found at Paddington Station? Was there someone who had convinced him to go? Someone who knew his weaknesses? He let her sit in silence for a moment, the weight of his questioning hanging in the air, before turning to Charles Montgomery. "Ah, Monsieur Montgomery," Poirot said, his tone shifting ever so slightly to a more professional cadence. "You mentioned earlier that you and Monsieur Varnum were engaged in business discussions. A merger, if I remember correctly. Can you tell me more about this? Was it a pressing matter?" Montgomery had been quiet during the exchanges with Eleanor, watching Poirot closely but saying little. The businessman was a man of control, not given to idle chatter. Poirot knew, however, that beneath that control lay the secrets of a man who knew how to manipulate others. Montgomery leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze flicking briefly toward Eleanor before he answered. Yes, it was a merger. We were finalizing some details regarding the merger with an overseas partner. It was a complicated deal, and we had set the final terms for that evening. James was eager to see it through, as it would have been very beneficial for both of us. Poirot leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Montgomery's every movement. So, it was business then, Poirot said. But tell me, monsieur, did Monsieur Varnum express any concerns regarding this business deal? I imagine such high stakes could make a man nervous. Montgomery's expression didn't falter, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. James was always in control. He never let business get to him like that. But of course, in a deal of that magnitude, there is always pressure. He was a pragmatic man. Poirot nodded again, his mind working faster than his mouth could speak. There was something about Montgomery's words that rang hollow. The man was too composed, too smooth in his delivery. People like Montgomery, who maintained a tight grip on their emotions, were often hiding something. But what? Poirot shifted his attention to Linda Richards, who had been nervously twisting her fingers together. Her anxiety was palpable, her eyes darting from one person to the next, never quite meeting Poirot's gaze. She was the youngest of the group, the most vulnerable, and yet there was something in her nervousness that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Mademoiselle Richards? Poirot began, his voice gentle, almost coaxing. I would like to ask you about your relationship with Monsieur Varnum. I understand that you were close, perhaps even more than just acquaintances. Would you care to elaborate? Linda's breath caught in her throat at the mention of Varnum's name, her face flushing slightly. She looked down at her hands, clearly unsure how to respond. I was close to James, she admitted after a long pause, her voice trembling. We had been seeing each other for a few months before he died. I didn't want anyone to know, but I couldn't hide it anymore. It wasn't just business for me. It was personal. He was kind, and I cared about him. Poirot's eyes softened as he observed her discomfort. And yet, despite your feelings, mademoiselle, you were not by his side when he met his end. Why is that? Linda's fingers clenched tighter around her sleeve. I wasn't supposed to be at the station. I didn't even know he was there. I was supposed to be at the office. I had to finish something. She paused, biting her lip. I didn't think it would be the last time I saw him. Poirot studied her closely, noticing the way her eyes shifted, the way she struggled to keep her composure. There was more to this than met the eye. A romantic relationship, secretive and strained, was bound to hide a few tangled emotions, but Linda's story was incomplete. Why hadn't she known about his plans to be at the station? And why did her words seem so rehearsed? Poirot straightened, his mind sifting through the details they had provided so far. There was tension in the room, a palpable undercurrent that flowed between them all. Each suspect had given their account, but Poirot could tell that they were not speaking the full truth. Madame Varnum, Monsieur Montgomery, Mademoiselle Richard. Poirot began, his voice calm but cutting through the silence. I must tell you this. One of you knows more than you have said. The truth is hidden beneath layers of words, and it will be my pleasure to find it. You will find that my little gray cells never fail me. The group stiffened, their eyes narrowing as they silently exchanged glances. Poirot had just begun to peel back the surface of their stories, and already he knew that they were not the innocent parties they wished to portray. With each subtle reaction, each slight hesitation, the game had begun, and Hercule Poirot was prepared to play it to its conclusion. Now let us continue. Poirot said, standing up and turning towards the door. "There is more to this mystery than any of you realize. And as for the man who never took the train, well, his journey is far from over." As Poirot left the room, his mind raced through the next steps. He would return to the scene, re-examine every detail. He would speak to the witnesses again, and when he returned, he would bring with him the truth, no matter how buried it was beneath the lies they told. The fog outside the station had thickened with the setting of the sun, and the yellow glow of street lamps barely pierced the heavy mist. Inside the constable's office, the room buzzed with nervous energy, the tension mounting as Poirot continued to piece together the fragments of the case. His mind, as always, was in motion, calm, deliberate, and focused on what he had seen, what he had heard, and what had been left unsaid. It had been hours since he had questioned the three main suspects, Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards. But Poirot knew that the answer would not come easily. If anything, the more they spoke, the more entangled their stories became. Each had their own story to tell, and all of them were hiding something. But it was the smallest details, the subtle missteps, that Poirot would use to unravel the truth. Poirot walked out of the room where the suspects had been waiting. As he made his way down the hallway, he paused by the open window, the chill of the night creeping in. He had already deduced certain things, but the key to unlocking this case lay in the motives and the lies they had so carefully constructed. Turning his attention back to the task at hand, Poirot realized that it was time to put his theory into action. He needed to visit the station again, to retrace Varnum's final steps, and to speak to anyone who might have seen him that night. He would start by revisiting the body. As Poirot walked towards the tracks, his sharp eyes took in every detail: the faint traces of footprints in the wet earth, the subtle scuff marks on the edges of the platform, the discarded ticket on the ground near the entrance. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign that Varnum had been pushed, no evidence of a robbery gone wrong. The tracks, as he had suspected earlier, were merely a backdrop. Varnum's death was not an accident. It was carefully staged to look that way. Poirot bent down and examined the ticket. It was an odd detail, for he had not been told that Varnum had purchased any ticket to travel. The train departure time matched the moment when the body had been discovered, and the ticket was for a departure to Paris, a route Varnum had never taken, not even in the best of circumstances. He despised the idea of leaving England, and yet here was a ticket for a train he would have never boarded. It didn't make sense. "Ah, but it is a clue, is it not?" Poirot muttered under his breath. "A clue planted to throw me off the trail." Poirot turned, his thoughts already spinning into motion. He needed to confront the others, to ask more questions. But before he could return to the suspects, there was a sudden shout from across the platform. A man, hurriedly running toward him, waved his arms frantically. "Mr. Poirot! Mr. Poirot!" the man called, breathless and looking frantic. Poirot raised an eyebrow, already sensing that the man's arrival was no mere coincidence. "Oui, monsieur," Poirot said, his voice calm but commanding. "What is it that brings you to me now?" The man, panting, seemed both nervous and eager, his words tumbling out in a rush. I saw something earlier. I thought it was nothing, but now I see that it might be important. I was the one who found the body." He paused to catch his breath, then continued. "I didn't want to say anything, but there was a man who saw the body before I did. I don't know who he was, but he was standing near the tracks just before the body was discovered. He was watching, not helping. I thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything at the time." Poirot's eyes sharpened, a slight frown creasing his brow. This new information was vital, a detail that had not been shared with him. "You are certain, monsieur? You did not mistake him for someone else?" The man nodded rapidly, his voice a nervous whisper. "No mistake. He was there, watching. And then, when I found the body, he was gone. Disappeared. Poirot stood still for a moment, processing the new information. The fact that someone had been watching the scene before the body had been found was no trivial matter. This was a key detail. But who was this person, and why had they been there? "Very well," Poirot said, his voice calm, his mind already analyzing the possibilities. "Thank you, monsieur. I shall look into this." The man hurried away, leaving Poirot to contemplate the new lead. A witness who had been present but had not come forward until now was troubling. The mystery was thickening, but the pieces were still scattered. Poirot knew the answers would not be found in the open. There were deeper layers to this crime, layers that only his precise mind could uncover. Poirot returned to the constable's office, where the three suspects awaited his return. The tension in the room was palpable. Poirot could feel the weight of their eyes on him as he entered. They had been questioned, but they were still holding something back. He could see it in the way they watched him, the subtle shifts in their body language, the way they glanced at one another when they thought he wasn't looking. "Monsieur Montgomery," Poirot began, turning to the business partner, "it seems there is something I have not yet addressed with you. A witness has come forward, someone who saw a man near the tracks before your business partner's body was discovered. He claims that this man was watching but did nothing to assist." Montgomery's expression did not change, but Poirot saw the faintest twitch in his eye. A subtle reaction, but one that Poirot would not miss. He had struck a nerve. "I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," Montgomery said evenly, but Poirot could sense the discomfort in his voice. "I was not at the station when the body was discovered. I'm afraid I cannot help you." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Montgomery's response. "Of course, monsieur. But I would like to know more about this business deal you mentioned. Was there someone, perhaps, who could confirm your whereabouts at the time of death?" Montgomery shifted uncomfortably. "I was with my lawyer at the time, finalizing paperwork." "And where was this lawyer?" Poirot pressed. Montgomery hesitated. He was away on business, as it happens. But that is irrelevant." Poirot raised a hand, signaling to the group that he was not done. "It is never irrelevant, Monsieur Montgomery. But I will leave this for now. Let us proceed, then." His gaze shifted to Linda Richards, who had been sitting quietly, her hands trembling as they clasped in her lap. She had been silent since Poirot's return, but now she looked up at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Mademoiselle Richard," Poirot said softly, "you knew Varnum, and you were close to him. But I have been made aware that you were not with him at the time of his death. Why then did you not come forward when you learned that he had been at the station?" Her eyes darted to the floor, and Poirot could tell that she was struggling to maintain her composure. "I didn't know. I didn't know about the station. I thought he was just meeting with someone. But I didn't think it would end like this." Poirot watched her carefully, noting the faint tremor in her voice. "You did not think it would end like this," he repeated, his voice calm but insistent. "You did not think. But you were not there when he needed you most." Linda's face paled, but she said nothing more. Poirot could feel the weight of her guilt hanging in the air. The false lead, Poirot realized, was not the man who had been seen near the tracks. It was the way the truth was being obscured by these carefully constructed stories. Each person had something to hide. But what, exactly? And so, as the night deepened, Poirot's work continued. The false leads were being discarded, but the truth was still buried deep. Yet he knew that with every step, every question, and every observation, he was getting closer. The game had only just begun, and Hercule Poirot was determined to win it. By the time the following morning arrived, Hercule Poirot had become more certain of one thing. The death of James Varnum was not a random act, nor was it a straightforward tragedy. It was an elaborate puzzle with many moving parts, each piece deliberately crafted to mislead. To solve it, Poirot knew he would have to engage not only his sharp intellect, but also the art of psychology. analyzing motives, contradictions, and behavior. His little gray cells were in full motion. The station, which had witnessed the death of Varnum, had grown quieter. The investigation was no longer a pressing matter for most of the public. Their interest had begun to wane, leaving only a few officers to watch over the scene. Yet for Poirot, this quietude was a gift, one that would allow him to observe more closely, to ask the right questions, and to truly understand the minds of the suspects. He spent the morning walking the length of the platform, examining every detail once more, looking for the signs that might reveal the real story. He returned to the tracks where Varnum's body had been discovered and closely scrutinized the area. It was then that something strange caught his eye. A small, barely noticeable scuff on the edge of the platform, just a few inches away from where Varnum had fallen. It was out of place. The mark looked fresh, as though someone had stood there only hours before. Poirot crouched to inspect it more closely. A heel print. This clue, seemingly insignificant to the untrained eye, told Poirot that someone had been standing near the spot just before the body had been discovered. He examined the ground around it, but found no other marks that could indicate the presence of anyone else. The mystery deepened. Whoever had been there must have been very careful. But why had they left behind such a faint trace? Poirot stood up, a small smile tugging at his lips. This was the first real lead. Whoever had made that mark might have been the same person who was watching when Varnum's body was found. Poirot returned to the office, where the suspects were awaiting him. They had been given no details of the investigation, though Poirot had no intention of revealing everything at once. His method was always to keep people off balance, to let them feel that the truth was just out of their reach. But now was the time to begin the next stage of his work, the psychological game. He entered the room where Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards were sitting, nervously exchanging glances. Poirot did not waste time. He went straight to the heart of the matter. "Monsieur Montgomery," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of something that seemed almost like amusement. "I would like to hear once more about your whereabouts last night. At the time, Monsieur Varnum was found dead. You said you were with your lawyer, but tell me, why were you so adamant that the affair was settled? Why the urgency?" Montgomery looked taken aback, his eyes flashing with irritation. "I've already explained everything. There was no urgency. It was just business." Poirot leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he observed Montgomery's reactions. The businessman's words were smooth, but the slight shift in his posture, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, told Poirot that he was lying. Poirot knew that people like Montgomery, people who were used to controlling every situation, could only hold their composure for so long before their true feelings emerged. "I see," Poirot said softly. "And yet, monsieur, you seem agitated. As if you have more to hide. Perhaps you had a stronger reason for wanting to ensure this deal went through. Perhaps you had something to gain from Monsieur Varnum's sudden disappearance?" Montgomery's expression darkened. "I do not know what you are implying," he snapped, "but you are mistaken." Poirot paused, allowing the tension to hang in the air. He wasn't trying to break Montgomery, at least not yet. What he needed was for Montgomery to begin questioning himself, to doubt his own story. He could see the businessman's defenses beginning to crack, just a little. Poirot would return to him later, when the time was right. Next, Poirot turned to Eleanor Varnum. Her icy demeanor had not shifted since their first meeting, but Poirot could see the subtle signs of anxiety. Her eyes flickered nervously as she sat rigidly in her chair. Poirot took his time, circling her like a cat sizing up a mouse. He needed to understand her role in all this. "Madame Varnum," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the silence, "you have not been forthcoming with me. You said that your husband never traveled by train, yet here we are, with a train ticket for a route he would never have taken. How do you explain this?" Eleanor's face paled, and for the first time, Poirot saw a crack in her composure. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of the chair. "I told you already. I don't know why he was there," she said, her voice tight. "He didn't tell me. He was always secretive about certain things, and I never asked questions." Poirot watched her carefully. There was something more to this, something that wasn't being said. But he couldn't push her too hard just yet. Instead, he allowed her words to linger in the air. "Very well," Poirot said, straightening. "We shall revisit this matter later. But tell me, Madame Varnum, have you noticed any changes in your husband's behavior recently? Something that might explain his sudden decision to visit Paddington Station despite his aversion to trains?" Eleanor's eyes shifted slightly, and for a brief moment, Poirot caught a glimmer of something, fear, perhaps, or guilt. She was hiding something, but she was also beginning to lose her hold on the situation. Poirot knew that she was not the mastermind, but she was undoubtedly a key player in this drama. Finally, Poirot turned to Linda Richards, whose nerves had only grown more apparent since his last visit. She was trembling, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and her gaze was fixed firmly on the floor. Poirot's approach was softer now, more coaxing, but no less sharp. "Mademoiselle Richard," Poirot said gently, "I would like you to consider something. You were involved with Monsieur Varnum. You were close to him, and yet you were not at the station when his body was found. Why is that?" Linda's face flushed, and she looked up at him, her eyes wide with panic. "I told you before, I didn't know. I thought he was at the office. I didn't know he was going to the station." Poirot smiled faintly. "You did not know. But surely you must have wondered why he went to such lengths to keep you in the dark. Why would he choose to go to the station if he were not intending to meet someone? Someone close to him?" Linda shook her head, her voice faltering. "I don't know. I don't understand any of this. I didn't know he was going there, Monsieur Poirot." Please believe me, Poirot studied her for a moment, watching the way she avoided his gaze, the way her body tensed whenever the conversation turned to Varnum. There was something in her reactions, something she wasn't saying. But Poirot knew that Linda Richards had a deeper connection to this case than she was willing to admit. The psychological game was beginning to take its toll on all of them. Eleanor, Montgomery, and Richards were starting to crack under the pressure, revealing small glimpses of their true feelings. And while none of them had yet confessed, Poirot knew that the truth was close, closer than any of them realized. As he left the room, his thoughts raced through the details. Each suspect had a story, but only one of them had the complete truth. And Poirot, with his impeccable understanding of human nature, would be the one to uncover it, no matter how deeply buried it was. The game was far from over, and Poirot was playing it with the precision of a master. As the hours wore on and the investigation deepened, Hercule Poirot felt a growing sense of unease. His mind, always sharp and unyielding, had noticed the smallest inconsistencies in the stories of the suspects. He had planted the seeds of doubt in their minds and watched as they shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. But something was missing. There was a darkness at the heart of this case that he had not yet uncovered, a deeper truth still hidden beneath the surface. It was late in the evening when Poirot's intuition, his little gray cells, led him to a startling revelation. His thoughts turned back to the seemingly innocuous details. The scuff mark on the platform, the ticket that did not match Varnum's usual behavior, the strange behavior of the suspects. Each clue, he realized, had been a breadcrumb leading him in the right direction. Yet it wasn't until he pieced them all together that the full scope of the crime became clear. Poirot had returned to the station in the late afternoon, under the pretext of re-examining the scene of the crime. The station was quiet, save for a few officers still scurrying about, following their own leads. Poirot's eyes scanned the tracks once more, but this time He was looking for something different. He wasn't searching for the body anymore. He was searching for the truth hidden in plain sight. His sharp eyes fell upon something he had missed earlier, a shadowy figure standing just inside the entrance of a nearby alleyway. The figure was tall and slightly hunched, as if trying to remain inconspicuous. Poirot approached cautiously, keeping his steps light and measured. The figure didn't notice him until he was only a few feet away, at which point the man turned sharply, his eyes widening in surprise. It was one of the station attendants, someone Poirot had spoken to briefly earlier in the investigation but had dismissed as unimportant at the time. Now, he realized his mistake. This man had been at the station long before the body was discovered, and it wasn't just his presence that raised Poirot's suspicions, it was the way the man was acting now, his eyes darting nervously, his hands fidgeting with his uniform. "Monsieur," Poirot said softly, stepping into the man's path. "I wonder if you could assist me with something. I've been told that you saw something unusual last night, something that might explain why the body of Monsieur Varnum was discovered so late. You were here, were you not?" The man stiffened, his face turning pale. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot," he stammered, his voice high and shaky. Poirot studied him carefully. "Do not lie to me, monsieur," Poirot said, his voice quiet but commanding. "You saw something that night, something that connects you to the case. Now, I suggest you tell me what it is, for I am not one to waste time with games." The man swallowed hard, his eyes flickering nervously between Poirot and the alleyway. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't know who they were, but they were watching the platform from the shadows. I didn't want to get involved, so I kept my distance." Poirot raised an eyebrow. This was unexpected. He had assumed the station attendant had no role in the matter, but now it seemed as though this man had witnessed something crucial. "Who was it, monsieur?" "What did you see?" Poirot pressed. The attendant hesitated again, his face contorted in confusion and fear. "I didn't recognize him," the man said finally. "But he was tall, dark hair, and he was dressed in a coat that seemed too heavy for the weather. He was watching Varnum's office window, not the tracks. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think anything of it at the time. I should have told someone, but I didn't." Poirot felt a sharp prickling of realization. This figure had been watching Varnum, not the station, which meant the person who had been waiting at the scene knew Varnum's movements. The connection was clear. This was no random accident. The person standing in the shadows had been waiting for something and someone, and when they saw Varnum arrive, the trap had been set. "Thank you, monsieur," Poirot said, his tone still calm but with an edge of finality. "You have been most helpful. I believe your testimony will provide much-needed clarity." Poirot turned away, his mind racing. This was the break he had been waiting for. He needed to return to the suspects and ask them the right questions. He would not rest until he had the truth. The following day, Poirot gathered the suspects once more, this time in the private room where the questioning had begun. He was ready to make his next move. Each of them had revealed small pieces of their story, but now it was time to confront them with the evidence. "Monsieur Montgomery," Poirot began, addressing the business partner first, "I have learned something that requires your explanation. You have stated many times that you were at the office when Varnum died. But, monsieur, I have been told that someone was seen watching Varnum's office window the night he died. Someone who knew exactly where to be. Can you explain this to me?" Montgomery's face paled slightly, and his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly. "I was at the office. I wasn't involved in anything." Poirot gave him a long, considering look. "You weren't involved? Or you simply don't want me to know about your involvement?" The tension in the room grew thick, and Poirot could see the strain in Montgomery's face. He was hiding something, and Poirot was certain of it. But he didn't press him further, yet. Madame Varnam, Poirot said next, his gaze moving to the widow. You too have been evasive with your answers. It seems that you knew more about your husband's behavior than you have let on. Why did he, of all places, choose to go to Paddington Station when he so despised trains? What was it that made him go that night? Eleanor's lips tightened, and for the first time, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. I don't know, she said stiffly. I've already told you everything I know. Poirot smiled gently. Ah, but you do know more. You may not think so, but you do. Your husband, it seems, had something to hide, and you, Madame Varnam, knew exactly what it was. Eleanor's expression faltered for a brief moment before she regained her composure. Poirot was playing a careful game now, but he knew that her story was beginning to unravel. Finally, Poirot turned to Linda Richards. The young woman had been quiet during the questioning of the others, but now it was her turn. Mademoiselle Richards, Poirot began, his voice soft but deliberate. You have been less than forthcoming. Your relationship with Varnam was more than mere acquaintance, and yet you were not at the station when his body was discovered. Why? Linda looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. I told you, I didn't know he was going there, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know anything about it. Poirot didn't believe her. But you did know something, mademoiselle. You knew about his fears, his reluctance to travel by train. You knew how important it was to him to avoid those situations. So why did he go to Paddington that night? What was it that pushed him to do so? Linda swallowed hard. Her face flushed. I don't know, she whispered. I didn't know anything about it. Poirot watched her closely. She wasn't telling the full truth, and he could sense it. But there was something else, something hidden beneath her nerves. She was the key to unlocking the final part of this puzzle, but he couldn't force her to speak. Not yet. As Poirot concluded the questioning, he stood in the center of the room, his mind racing. Each of the suspects had played their part in this elaborate deception, but the truth was close. The pieces were coming together, and the answer was nearly within reach. One last move was all that was needed to crack the case wide open. Soon, Poirot would make his final move, and the real murderer would be revealed. But for now, he allowed the suspects to remain in their confusion, unsure of just how close they were to being exposed. The game was not over yet, but Poirot was certain of one thing: the truth was within his grasp. The investigation had now reached a delicate stage. Hercule Poirot had questioned the suspects repeatedly, analyzed the evidence from every possible angle, and tested his own theories against their responses. Yet, despite his meticulous work, something still didn't sit quite right. There was an elusive quality to this case that kept him at arm's length from the final answer. That night, Poirot found himself back at the station. The fog had thickened again, and the distant sound of trains arrived in steady succession, each one carrying with it a promise of more answers. But for Poirot, there were no answers to be found in the trains or in the platforms. He was drawn once more to the area where James Varnam had been discovered, standing before the same tracks, in the same cold silence. Something about the scene nagged at him. The body had been found precisely where it needed to be, the positioning too perfect to be coincidental. It wasn't just the ticket found at the scene. It wasn't just the strange figure watching from the shadows, nor the seemingly random clues strewn across the platform. Number. It was the small, almost insignificant detail that Poirot had been blind to until now. It had been in plain sight all along, hidden by his own assumptions. He knelt by the tracks once more, staring intently at the ground. This time his eyes were searching for a particular detail, one that might have been overlooked in the initial frenzy. His gaze fell upon something that seemed out of place. A faint, irregular indentation on the edge of the track, barely visible under the dim light. Poirot's sharp eyes immediately recognized what it was. A small object had been dropped there, almost deliberately. He leaned forward and delicately picked it up with his gloved hand. It was a small, polished piece of wood, no longer than the width of his palm, weathered and smooth from use. He examined it carefully, noting the fine craftsmanship. This wasn't a random object. It had been handled by someone who knew what they were doing. Poirot's mind raced, piecing the puzzle together as he stood up slowly, his face a mask of deep concentration. He knew with a certainty that filled him to the core that this small piece of wood was the missing link. It had been dropped here intentionally, placed just so to misdirect. This was no accident. It was a sign, proof that the crime had been carefully orchestrated. He had found his first hidden clue. Poirot walked slowly away from the tracks, his thoughts in overdrive. He needed to return to the suspects now. They had been lying, concealing the truth from him. But what had they been hiding? What was the connection between Varnum's fear of trains, the mysterious ticket, and this peculiar piece of wood? Poirot couldn't yet say for sure, but he was closer than ever to the heart of the mystery. The next day, Poirot gathered the suspects once again. He had no time to waste. The pieces of the puzzle were now falling into place, and the time for careful observation had passed. It was time for the confrontation, the final step before the truth would emerge. Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards sat in the same room as before, their faces tense with anticipation. None of them had been forthcoming in their answers, but Poirot was no longer interested in polite conversation. He had all the answers he needed. What remained was to draw them out, to watch how they responded under pressure. Monsieur Montgomery, Poirot began, his voice calm but penetrating. I have found something. Something that you know about, I believe. Montgomery looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he caught Poirot's gaze. What are you talking about? Poirot ignored his question, turning instead to the piece of wood he had retrieved from the station. He placed it on the table before Montgomery, allowing it to sit there in silence. Do you recognize this? Poirot asked, his voice steady. Montgomery's face stiffened, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked briefly toward the object. He made no attempt to reach for it or to engage with it directly. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on Poirot, trying to maintain control. I don't know what that is, Montgomery said, his voice forced but calm. Poirot leaned in slightly, his gaze unyielding. No, you don't know, he repeated, his tone just shy of mocking. Perhaps you do not recognize it as an object, but surely, monsieur, you recognize its significance. Montgomery remained silent, and Poirot could tell that his discomfort was growing. The businessman's usual composure was beginning to crack. Poirot pressed on. I found this at the scene of the crime, monsieur. It is a piece of finely crafted wood, not the sort of thing one might expect to find lying near a body. You would agree. I imagine Montgomery's eyes shifted momentarily to the object, but he said nothing. Poirot continued, his voice steady but piercing. This piece of wood, it is not simply a scrap of random material. It is part of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that you, monsieur, are directly involved in. Finally, Montgomery spoke, his voice tight with anxiety. I don't know what you're implying, Poirot, he said, his hands shifting uncomfortably on the table. I have no idea where that came from. You're making assumptions. Poirot stood back, his eyes narrowing. Assumptions? He echoed. No, Monsieur Montgomery, I do not make assumptions. I observe, and I have observed you closely. That piece of wood is from something far more deliberate than what you claim. You were involved in the creation of this scheme, and you know it. Montgomery's face flushed with anger. I am not involved in any scheme. You are mistaken. Poirot turned away from Montgomery, his gaze now fixed on Eleanor Varnum, who had been silent until now. She was watching Poirot with a look of quiet apprehension, but there was something more in her eyes. an emotion that betrayed her growing unease. "Madame Varnum," Poirot said, his voice even but carrying a hint of accusation. "It seems that you know more than you've let on. You told me some time ago that your husband had a deep aversion to trains, and yet we have the ticket, don't we? The one he could never have purchased willingly, the ticket to Paris." Eleanor stiffened, her face turning pale. Her lips trembled slightly, but she did not answer. "Why, Madame Varnum, would your husband suddenly decide to board a train, of all things? And why, of all places, would he choose Paddington Station?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she looked away for a moment, as though trying to find the words. When she spoke, her voice was shaky. I didn't know he was planning to travel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know anything about it." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Madame, you are lying. You know exactly why your husband went to Paddington, and you know exactly what happened next. You were involved in this scheme, whether you care to admit it or not." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she held herself together, refusing to break down. "I didn't want any part of it," she whispered. "I didn't know he would die. I never wanted any of this." Poirot turned to Linda Richards, who had been watching the exchange in silence. Her face was pale, and she seemed to shrink back in her seat as Poirot's attention shifted to her. "Mademoiselle Richard," Poirot said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "You were involved with Monsieur Varnum, were you not?" Linda's eyes widened, and she swallowed hard. She could no longer avoid the question. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And you," Poirot continued, "you too know the truth behind his death. You know why he went to the station, and you know exactly who was behind this." Linda recoiled slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I didn't know anything," she said, almost pleading. "I didn't know it would end like this. I thought he was just meeting someone." Poirot looked at her for a moment, then turned to face all three of them. They had all lied. They had all been part of the same twisted scheme, each hiding their own role in Varnum's death. "The game is over," Poirot said, his voice firm. "The truth is out. You have all been involved in one way or another, and now you will pay the price for your lies." With those words, Poirot knew that the case had finally come to its conclusion. The mystery had been unraveled, layer by layer, and the truth was now undeniable. It was only a matter of time before the full story would be revealed to the world, and justice would be served. As the final day of questioning approached, the tension in the room had escalated to a fever pitch. The suspects were not mere players in the game anymore. They were participants, trapped in a web they had woven themselves. Hercule Poirot had seen enough. The truth, though still buried beneath layers of deception, had become undeniable. The psychological pressure had worn them down, their defenses weakened by their own guilt. Poirot had invited the suspects back to the private room where they had all first gathered. The air was thick with unease, their faces all drawn and anxious, yet none had dared to speak freely until now. Each of them knew the walls were closing in. Their stories, so carefully crafted, had been dismantled piece by piece, and now only the final reckoning remained. Poirot stood at the head of the table, his back straight, his gaze as sharp and calculating as ever. His eyes scanned the faces of Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards. Each of them was trying desperately to maintain some semblance of composure, but Poirot could see through their facades. The masks they wore were slipping, revealing the true depth of their involvement in the crime. "Monsieur Montgomery," Poirot began, his voice calm yet laced with an undeniable authority, "I believe it is time we have a final conversation. We have discussed your business dealings, your alibis, and your supposed indifference to the events that led to the tragic death of Monsieur Varnum. Yet, monsieur, I am not convinced. There are too many holes in your story and too many contradictions in your statements." Montgomery's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He was trying to maintain control, trying to keep his composure in the face of Poirot's relentless questioning. His eyes darted briefly toward Eleanor, as if seeking some kind of support, but she remained silent. Poirot's gaze never wavered. "You see, Monsieur Montgomery, I have discovered something very curious. The piece of wood that I found at the station, a piece of wood that, as you may recall, is very deliberately carved and polished. Now, I know that you are a man of wealth and influence, but I also know that you are a man who enjoys having a hand in every detail. This piece of wood was no accident. It was placed there intentionally, and I have reason to believe that you knew exactly why it was there." Montgomery's eyes flickered briefly, and Poirot noted the change. The businessman was losing his hold. His mask was slipping, and the cracks were starting to show. Poirot continued, his voice growing more insistent. "I also know that you had more than just a professional relationship with Monsieur Varnum. You were partners in business, yes, but you were also tied to him in other ways. Your motives were not merely financial. You had a personal stake in seeing this merger through, no matter the cost." Montgomery opened his mouth, but Poirot raised a hand to silence him. "Do not bother to deny it. We both know the truth now. You were involved in Varnum's death, whether you want to admit it or not. And I believe you thought you could get away with it, bury the truth beneath lies, behind the veneer of a businessman protecting his assets." Montgomery's face twisted with frustration, and for a moment, Poirot thought he might lash out. But instead, the businessman leaned back in his chair, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "You are right," Montgomery said, his voice flat. "I was involved. But it was never supposed to go this far. It was supposed to be clean, no violence, just a simple accident. I never thought things would spiral out of control the way they did." Poirot's lips twitched in a faint smile. "It is always the same, is it not? A small lie, a single choice, and before you know it, it grows beyond your control." Eleanor Varnum's breath caught in her throat, and she looked at Montgomery with a mixture of disdain and something darker, perhaps fear or guilt. Poirot saw the way she held herself back, as if resisting the urge to speak, but he knew that she had been complicit, just as Montgomery had been. "Madame Varnum," Poirot said, shifting his focus to her, "you too have much to answer for. You knew your husband better than anyone, and yet you failed to protect him. You let him walk into a trap. Your involvement, while less direct, is no less significant." Eleanor stiffened, her back straightening as she tried to maintain her composure. I didn't know what was going to happen," she stammered, her voice shaking. "I didn't know he would be killed. I just wanted the business deal to go through. I wanted to keep everything in order." That was all. Poirot's eyes softened ever so, slightly, though his words were unyielding. "Ah, but that is the problem, is it not? You wanted to keep everything in order. You wanted to maintain the facade of a perfect life, of a perfect marriage. But beneath that facade, there were secrets. Secrets that you were willing to bury, even if it meant putting your husband in harm's way." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she did not speak. She had no defense against Poirot's deductions. She was trapped in her own web of lies, and she knew it. Poirot's gaze moved to Linda Richards, who had been silent throughout the exchange, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Linda had always been the most difficult of the three to read. Her nervousness, her fear, had masked her true involvement in the crime. But now, Poirot knew that it was time to confront her directly. "Mademoiselle Richard," Poirot began, his voice quieter now, "you too have been hiding the truth. You knew Varnum better than anyone. You had the most to lose, and you were the one most affected by his death. Your relationship with him was not as simple as you claimed. It was complicated. You had your own motives for wanting him gone." Linda's face paled, and she swallowed hard. I didn't want him dead," she whispered. "I just wanted him to choose me. I thought if I could get him away from his wife, everything would be different. But I never wanted him to die. I never wanted any of this. Poirot studied her carefully, watching the tears well up in her eyes. No, mademoiselle, you did not want him to die. But you were complicit nonetheless. You were involved in a game that you couldn't control, and now it is time for you to face the consequences of your actions. Linda's eyes dropped to the table, her face crumpling in defeat. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said softly, her voice breaking. But I knew. I knew he had to go. I thought I could get him to choose me over his wife. I was desperate, Poirot nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. Desperation, yes. It is the driving force behind many crimes. And now, all of you, each of you, will have to answer for the part you played in this tragedy. Poirot stepped back from the table, his hands clasped behind his back. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. He could see the guilt written plainly on their faces, their posture slack with resignation. The truth had been uncovered, and there was no turning back. Justice will be served, of course, Poirot continued, his voice steady but final. But not just for the crime itself. No, the true justice is the acknowledgement of the lives you have ruined with your actions. The lives that were taken, the ones destroyed by greed, by lies, by ambition. He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over them. The game is over, and the truth is now revealed. As Poirot left the room, his mind was clear. The case had come to its natural conclusion. The murderer, though not one individual, had been exposed. Each suspect had contributed to the crime, each with their own hidden motives and desires. There was no single villain in this story. There were three. The detectives would soon arrive to take the suspects away, and Poirot would return to his life. But the sense of satisfaction he felt, the certainty that justice had been done, would stay with him for a long time. For Hercule Poirot, solving the case was never about the glory or the recognition. It was about the truth. And with every case he solved, he knew that his small part in the world had made a difference, however small. The truth had a way of coming to light, and it was always Poirot's privilege to bring it forward. The dim light of the evening had already started to fade as Hercule Poirot made his way to the center of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the three suspects seated before him. He had seen the guilt, the discomfort, and the hesitation in their eyes during the final questioning. But now it was time for the culmination, the moment where everything would be revealed. Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards had each played their part in the elaborate deception. But it was only now, as Poirot stood before them, that they would understand the full extent of their involvement. The truth was no longer hidden, no longer masked by their lies. It was time for the curtain to fall. Poirot took his seat at the head of the table, his hands clasped in front of him. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere in the room. The suspects, though trying to maintain composure, were clearly on edge. They had waited for this moment, knowing that Poirot would soon pull back the curtain and expose everything. They did not know how much longer they could pretend. Madame Varnum, Poirot began, his voice steady but filled with authority. Monsieur Montgomery, Mademoiselle Richard, this is the moment of truth. We have spent enough time piecing together the fragments of this puzzle, and now we will examine the final picture. The story, as you all know, has been one of lies, betrayal, and deceit. And now it is time for the truth to be laid bare. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened around the arms of her chair. Montgomery shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting to the table as though searching for something, anything to distract him from Poirot's gaze. Linda, meanwhile, had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear, her lips trembling as she stared at the floor. Poirot knew that each of them was desperately trying to hold on to their composure, but he could see through them. He had already seen through their defenses. The truth had been clear for some time now, and it was only a matter of time before they understood that their carefully constructed stories were no match for Poirot's scrutiny. He leaned forward, his eyes locking on to each of them in turn. Let us start with the basics. The death of Monsieur Varnum. An unfortunate accident, some might have thought. A random tragedy. But the truth, as I have shown you all, is far more sinister. Eleanor's jaw tightened, and Montgomery let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. Linda, however, remained silent, her fear mounting with each passing second. The man who never took the train, Poirot continued, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight, was James Varnum. A man who had a deep fear of trains, a man who would never voluntarily step onto a train platform, let alone purchase a ticket. And yet, on that fateful night, he was found at Paddington Station with a ticket to Paris, a ticket for a train he had never planned to board. Poirot paused, allowing the significance of his words to sink in. He could see the subtle shift in the suspect's expressions. Eleanor's lips parted slightly. Montgomery's brow furrowed, and Linda's eyes flicked nervously from one person to another. They were beginning to understand. They could feel the weight of their actions bearing down on them. Poirot continued, his tone unyielding. Now, we must consider the key to this puzzle. The man who was seen watching from the shadows, the figure who was at the station before the body was discovered. This man, Monsieur Montgomery, you know him well. He was not just a casual bystander. He was involved, and he was there to make sure that everything went according to plan. Montgomery's eyes widened, and for the first time he opened his mouth to speak. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his voice defensive but lacking the usual confidence. "I had no part in this." Poirot smiled faintly, his gaze piercing. "You may deny it, Monsieur Montgomery, but the evidence is clear. You were at the station, watching, waiting. You knew exactly what was happening, and you were prepared to make sure that everything played out as it was supposed to." Eleanor looked at Montgomery, her expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "You were involved in this. You lied to me." About everything. Montgomery's face flushed, and he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Poirot's attention shifted to Linda. She had been quiet throughout the exchange, but now her eyes were filled with tears. She looked at Poirot, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want him dead. I didn't want any of this." Poirot's gaze softened, but his words were firm. "You, Mademoiselle Richards, were the final piece in this web of deception. You knew the truth about Varnum, about his fears and his desires. You knew he would never leave his wife, but you also knew that you couldn't have him unless something drastic happened. And so, you became involved. You allowed yourself to be part of this conspiracy, part of a plan to force Varnum's hand." Linda looked up at him, her face filled with regret. "I never meant for him to die. I thought if I could get him away from her, we could be together. I never thought it would end like this." Poirot nodded slowly. "Ah, yes, the danger of thinking too much of oneself. You did not think of the consequences, Mademoiselle Richards. You did not think about what would happen if things went wrong. But now you must face the truth." The room fell silent once more. Each suspect had been exposed for what they were, accomplices in a crime they had thought they could control. The lies they had told, the stories they had woven, all fell apart in the face of Poirot's relentless pursuit of the truth. Poirot stood up, his eyes scanning the three of them one last time. "It is clear now, is it not? Each of you played a part in this crime. Each of you had your own reasons, your own desires. But in the end, it was your collective actions that led to the death of James Varnum. And now it is time for you to face the consequences of those actions." Eleanor Varnum looked at Poirot, her face a mask of cold anger. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat. "You think you've uncovered the truth. But you're wrong. You don't understand the pressure we were under. You don't know what it's like to be in our position." Poirot's gaze hardened. "I understand perfectly, Madame Varnum. I understand that desperation leads people to do terrible things. I understand that fear of losing control can make people do the unthinkable. But I also understand that justice must be served." Montgomery finally spoke, his voice low and resigned. "I never wanted it to end like this. I thought I could control it. But now it's all falling apart." Poirot turned to Linda, his voice softer. "And you, Mademoiselle Richards, have learned a hard lesson. A lesson about the price of desire and the consequences of choosing your own path without considering the lives of others." Linda nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought it would go this far. I never thought." Poirot stood silent for a moment, his gaze lingering on the three of them. The truth had been exposed, the puzzle had been solved, and now the time for justice had come. "Your lies have been undone," Poirot said quietly, "but the damage remains. Varnum is dead, and you will all have to face the consequences. It is not my place to decide your fate. That will be for the authorities to determine. But rest assured, the truth has been revealed, and no matter how much you try to deny it, you cannot escape it." The room was still. The final moment had arrived. The truth was laid bare, and the suspects could no longer hide behind their lies. Poirot turned and left the room, his work done. The case had been solved, and justice had been served. As he walked away, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. For Hercule Poirot, this was the true reward, the satisfaction of seeing the truth come to light and knowing that the game had been won. The morning after the reveal, the cool autumn air filled the streets of London as Poirot made his way back to his small, neatly kept apartment. His steps were slow and deliberate, not out of weariness, but from the weight of the case that had consumed his mind for weeks. Each case Poirot solved, no matter how complex or intricate, left a mark on him. But there was a certain finality in this one. He knew the truth. And now, the truth would be made known to others. The room he entered was as meticulously ordered as always, the polished wood and the delicate furnishings reflecting the precision and control he so valued. Poirot placed his hat upon the coat rack and sat down, his fingers steepled before him, reflecting on the sequence of events that had unfolded. The final piece had fallen into place the previous evening. He had exposed the culprits, their lies, their motives, their twisted web of manipulation. But justice, though served through his sharp intellect, was still not in his hands. It would be up to the authorities to decide what would happen to the three suspects: Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards. For now, Poirot could do nothing more than wait and reflect on the events that had led to this point. His thoughts turned to Varnum, the man who had never taken the train, the man who had been ensnared in a web of ambition, fear, and misguided loyalty. Varnum had been a man of wealth and influence, yet he had fallen prey to the darker side of human nature. His reluctance to board a train had been his undoing, for it was only through his weaknesses, his fears and vulnerabilities, that his death had been orchestrated. The irony was too much for Poirot to ignore. The man who never took the train had been killed by the very thing he feared. Poirot had uncovered the truth in his usual manner, by peeling away the layers, exposing the contradictions, and observing the smallest details, and yet, as he sat alone in his quiet apartment, a sense of melancholy settled over him. The truth had come to light, but there was no joy in it, no satisfaction to be found in the consequences that would follow for those responsible for Varnum's death. Poirot had always believed that human nature was flawed, that everyone had the capacity for both good and evil. But it was the actions of people like Eleanor, Montgomery, and Richards that proved to him how fragile the line between right and wrong truly was. They had all been involved in the death of James Varnum, and each of them had their own reasons for doing so. They had all played their part, but in the end, they had been undone by their own ambitions, fears, and desires. As the day wore on, Poirot received a letter from Chief Inspector Japp, who had been handling the investigation from the start. The letter was brief, but to the point, confirming what Poirot already knew. The 3 suspects had been arrested, their fates now in the hands of the law. Several weeks later, Poirot found himself once again in his office, reading through a report on the case. The trial had come and gone, and the outcome had been as expected. Montgomery had been sentenced to a lengthy prison term for his role in the conspiracy to murder Varnum, while Eleanor Varnum had been deemed an accomplice, guilty of aiding and abetting her husband's death. Linda Richards, though somewhat less culpable, had been charged with manslaughter, and she too would serve time in prison. It was an outcome that felt neither satisfying nor just. The law had done its job, but Poirot was left with the nagging feeling that the true justice had not been served. Varnum was dead, and no sentence could ever bring him back. No amount of punishment could undo the damage that had been done. The truth, however necessary, had come too late. Poirot placed the report down and sat back in his chair, his fingers once again steepled in thought. His mind was sharp as always, but there was an emptiness that lingered, one that came with the realization that, despite his success in solving the case, there was no true resolution. The people involved were guilty, yes, but they had paid their price, and now they were behind bars. And yet, Poirot could not shake the feeling that something vital had been lost in the process. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Varnum had been a man of flaws, as all men are, but his death had been a tragic result of his own mistakes and the mistakes of those around him. Eleanor, Montgomery, and Linda had all been trapped by their own desires, but their lives had been forever altered as well. Poirot had solved the case, exposed the criminals, and delivered the truth. But that truth, he now realized, had been bittersweet. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Poirot stood up and walked to the door, opening it to find Chief Inspector Japp standing there, a somber expression on his face. "Ah, Poirot," Japp said, stepping inside. "I trust you've seen the reports." "The trial's over. The sentences have been handed down." "Yes, I've seen the reports," Poirot replied, his voice soft but firm. "The law has done its work, as always." Japp nodded but didn't speak for a moment. He seemed lost in thought. Finally, he turned to Poirot and spoke again. "You know, Poirot, I've been thinking about this case, about how everything played out. We followed the clues, we found the evidence, and we got the guilty parties. But something about it still doesn't sit right with me." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his interest piqued. "Indeed. What is it that troubles you, mon cher Japp?" Japp paused for a moment, his hands folded, behind his back. I think it's the fact that, in the end, they all got what they deserved. The law caught up with them, and they paid the price. But none of them really had to face the true consequences. None of them really faced what they had done. They've all been taken care of by the law, but I don't know. It just doesn't feel finished." Poirot nodded slowly, understanding what Japp was getting at. "I see, Japp. You are right in some respects. The law does its job. But what of the morality? What of the human cost? The truth, the consequences? It is not always so simple as a legal outcome. Varnum is dead, and the others are in prison. But what of the emotional and psychological toll they will carry for the rest of their lives?" Japp looked at Poirot, his expression thoughtful. "You mean they'll never really be free?" Poirot's gaze was distant as he nodded. "No, Japp. they will never be free. The truth may have set them on a path of punishment, but their guilt, their actions, will haunt them for as long as they live. That is the true justice, is it not? The knowledge that no matter what happens to them, they will carry the weight of their choices for the rest of their lives. Japp sat down in the chair opposite Poirot, deep in thought. The two men sat in silence for a long while, reflecting on the case and the nature of justice. In the end, Poirot knew that his work was done. The case had been solved, the criminals apprehended, and the truth revealed. But the real consequences, those were something that only time could reveal. Poirot's mind wandered back to the man who never took the train. James Varnum had been a victim of his own fears, his own choices, and his own inability to face the truth. His death had been tragic, but it was also a reminder of the fragility of human nature. No one was immune to the darkness within. In the end, justice had been served, but it had come at a heavy price. And though Poirot's mind was satisfied, his heart was not. For in every case he solved, he was reminded that there was always something more, something beneath the surface that could never truly be understood. And with that thought, Poirot closed the case, knowing that the game would continue. There would always be another mystery, another puzzle to solve. But the answers, he knew, would never bring him the peace he sought. The passing days had brought no relief to the heavy silence that now hung over Hercule Poirot's life. The case of James Varnum had reached its legal conclusion. The suspects had been convicted, the consequences meted out. Yet, as Poirot reflected upon the details of the investigation, something within him still felt unsettled. For all the clarity of his deductions, for all the meticulous unraveling of motives and contradictions, there lingered a sense of incompleteness. What had driven the perpetrators to commit such a crime? And more importantly, why did they feel so trapped in their webs of lies, yet persist in spinning them? Poirot had always prided himself on his capacity for understanding human nature. His little gray cells could reveal the most hidden truths, but even they had their limits. The law had taken its course, the investigation had been closed, but the personal cost of the crime lingered for him as it would for the guilty. Now, as he sat in his modest apartment, his usual environment, where the work of solving mysteries gave him solace, he could not escape the sense that something essential had been overlooked. Poirot rose from his desk, his gaze falling on the array of papers scattered about. The case files were complete. The trial had reached its verdict. He had accomplished what he set out to do, but now, in this quiet moment, the complexities of the crime seemed to be stretching further into the distance, beyond the confines of the law, beyond the realm of punishment and restitution. In the quietude of his office, Poirot began to replay the events in his mind. Eleanor Varnum had been motivated by her obsession with maintaining control over her husband's actions, control over the future of the family business. The tragedy of her motivations had been her failure to recognize that she could not control the uncontrollable, human emotions, human desires. It was not enough to be the perfect wife, to be a model of grace and decorum. Her husband's unwillingness to choose her over his duties, his unease with their marriage, had driven her to desperation. Yet, despite her outward composure, Eleanor had been the most vulnerable of them all. She had tried to control the situation with her husband's death, only to become consumed by guilt and regret. Charles Montgomery, too, had been motivated by fear of failure, fear of losing everything. His connection to Varnum was not merely financial, but tied to a more personal sense of inadequacy. He had seen the wealth, the power that Varnum held, and in his own twisted perception, Montgomery believed that by eliminating Varnum, he would gain not just a business partner, but the unchallenged power he desired. His cold rationality had betrayed him. He had thought that killing Varnum would be the price of stability, but in the end, it was the price of his downfall. Linda Richards had been driven by an entirely different force: love. or what she perceived to be love. But in truth, her affection for Varnum had been more of a possessive yearning. She had allowed her own emotional desires to blind her to the cost of what she sought. By taking part in the conspiracy to murder Varnum, she had believed that she would find happiness in his arms, but she had only ensnared herself in a trap of guilt. Her emotions were raw, unrefined, and ultimately destructive. Poirot sat down again, contemplating the web of human frailty and fear that had led to a man's death. In the end, it was not merely the crime that haunted him, it was the realization that none of the guilty parties had fully understood the consequences of their actions until it was too late. They had been trapped, not by Varnum, but by their own motives, their own weaknesses. And then there was Varnum himself, the man who never took the train, the man whose life had been cut short by the very thing he feared most. He had never truly understood that his fear was part of his downfall. His reluctance to face the truth, to confront his own emotions, had ultimately sealed his fate. Varnum had been a man of contradictions, smart, driven, yet deeply insecure. It was this insecurity that had led to his demise. He had tried to control his circumstances, but in the end, the very thing he sought to avoid had destroyed him. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his thoughts lingering on the case. The clues had all been there. The ticket to Paris, the strange behavior at the station, the false leads. But they had been nothing more than the surface of the deeper, more complicated truth. The murder was not a crime of passion, nor a mere act of greed. It was an act of self-preservation, each participant trying to save themselves from something they feared more than anything else. Whether it was the loss of power, the loss of control, or the loss of love. The door to Poirot's office opened with a soft creak, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Chief Inspector Japp had arrived, his face showing signs of wear. His demeanor was less composed than usual, a reflection, perhaps, of the strain the case had put on him. "Poirot," Japp said, stepping further into the room. "I wanted to check in with you. I've read through all the reports, and the sentences have been handed down. I know you've been reviewing everything, but I wanted to ask, how do you feel about it? The outcome?" Poirot remained quiet for a moment, his fingers still steepled. He understood what Japp was asking. The case had been wrapped up neatly from a legal standpoint, but Poirot's feelings were far from resolved. He had solved the puzzle, yes, but the answer had come at too great a cost. "The law has done its work, Japp," Poirot replied softly. "The guilty have been convicted. Justice has been served, at least in the eyes of the law. But as you know, there is more to justice than what is done in a courtroom." Japp nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as he took a seat across from Poirot. "I understand. There's something about this case that doesn't sit right with me either. These people, Montgomery, Eleanor, and Richards, they've all paid their price, but there's no satisfaction in it, no closure. It feels like we've punished them for the wrong reasons." Poirot sighed, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, Japp. It is the human element that makes this case so unsettling. The motives were all rooted in fear, fear of losing something, fear of being exposed. They didn't want to face their own failures, they didn't want to confront their own flaws. And in the end, they destroyed not only the man who they thought stood in their way, but themselves as well." Japp shifted in his seat. "It's ironic, isn't it? Montgomery thought he'd gain power by eliminating Varnum. Eleanor thought she could keep control over everything, including her husband. Richards thought she'd get the man she loved. But in the end, all of them lost. They didn't get what they wanted." Poirot nodded gravely. "No, they did not. And perhaps the real tragedy of this case is that they were all so blinded by their own desires that they never truly understood what they had lost." Japp leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "And Varnum? What about him? He never took the train, but in the end, it was a train ticket to Paris that led to his death. A man so afraid of trains, but his fear didn't save him. Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Varnum was, in many ways, the most tragic figure in this whole affair. His fear, his inability to face the truth, made him vulnerable. He tried to control everything around him, but in the end, it was his own fears that led to his downfall. Japp paused, then spoke quietly. "And what do you think, Poirot? Was justice served?" Poirot thought for a long time before answering. Justice is a complex thing, Japp. The law has done its job, but there are other forms of justice. Emotional, psychological, moral. Perhaps in this case, the true justice is the knowledge that each of them will live with the weight of their actions for the rest of their life. Japp leaned forward, his voice tinged with thoughtfulness. "And what about you, Poirot? Are you satisfied with the way things turned out?" Poirot smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the quiet depth of his thoughts. "Satisfaction, my friend, is not a word I often use in this line of work. I solve the puzzle, I uncover the truth. But satisfaction comes only when the soul is at peace, and that is not something I find in the work I do. The truth is often too painful to be satisfying. It is simply the truth." As Japp sat in silence, reflecting on Poirot's words, the two men understood that the case of James Varnum had come to its natural conclusion, but its emotional toll would remain long after the verdict had been delivered. The world would move on, but for those involved, the shadows of the past would linger. And for Hercule Poirot, the weight of knowing the truth, without ever fully attaining peace, was both his gift and his burden. The final piece had fallen into place. The investigation had been drawn to its inevitable conclusion. The criminals had been exposed, the evidence laid bare, and the case that had started with a seemingly innocuous death on a train platform now rested in the hands of the law. And yet, as Hercule Poirot sat in his chair, staring out of the window at the bustling city below, he couldn't shake the feeling of something unresolved, something that would not let go of him. Justice had been served. Yes. Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards had been sentenced. They would face the consequences of their actions, and yet Poirot knew, deep down, that justice alone would never be enough to settle the accounts of this case. No punishment could undo the damage done. No sentence could bring back the life that had been lost. The emotional wreckage that had been caused would endure far longer than any legal retribution. His mind drifted back to the final moments of the case, when he had gathered the suspects in that small room and revealed the truth. He had seen the realization wash over their faces. The shock, the fear, the guilt. Each one had tried to deny their involvement, to distance themselves from the truth, but in the end, they had been unable to escape their own lies. The pieces of the puzzle had fit together too perfectly. Their motives had been revealed, their actions exposed for all to see. But it was not just the act of solving the crime that had haunted Poirot. It was the consequences, the impact on their lives, the ripple effect that would stretch out into the future. And then there was Varnum, the man who never took the train. The man whose death had been caused by the very fear he had lived with all his life. Varnum had tried to control everything, from his business dealings to his personal life, but in the end, it was his inability to confront his own weaknesses, his own vulnerabilities, that had led to his death. Poirot had pieced together the story, had uncovered the motives, the lies, the guilt. And yet Varnum's death still felt like an unfinished chapter in a larger story, a story that had no neat conclusion, no satisfying resolution. The door to Poirot's apartment opened, and Inspector Japp stepped inside. His face was grave, his usual jovial demeanor absent. The weight of the case was still heavy on his shoulders, just as it was on Poirot's. Japp had been through countless cases with Poirot, but this one had left a mark on him as well. "Poirot," Japp said quietly, stepping into the room, "I've been meaning to speak with you." I've been thinking about this case ever since it ended, about how it all played out, and I can't help but feel like there's more to it than just what we uncovered. Poirot looked at Jap, his expression thoughtful. Ah, you feel it too, Jap, don't you? The feeling that, despite everything, there is still something left unresolved. Jap nodded, taking a seat across from Poirot. Exactly. We caught the criminals. The law has taken its course, but there's something about this case that just doesn't sit right with me. It's like we solved the mystery, but not the whole story. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered Jap's words. Yes, my friend. You are correct. The case has been solved. The perpetrators have been punished. And yet, there is something missing. Perhaps it is the very thing that makes us human. The emotional weight, the toll that is exacted when people make choices, when they act out of fear, or love, or greed. We have exposed the truth, but the consequences of their actions will stay with them for the rest of their lives. Jap sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. I don't know, Poirot. I've been through enough cases to know that the law does what it's supposed to do, but this one feels different. It's like we've been handed all the pieces, but there's still something left out, something that we'll never be able to fully grasp. Poirot nodded slowly. You're right. Sometimes, Jap, the truth is not enough. We expose the lies, we reveal the hidden motives, and we bring the criminals to justice. But in the end, the emotional cost, the personal toll, is something we can never fully fix. The damage is done, and the only thing left is the aftermath. Jap stared at the floor for a long moment before speaking again. What do you think happens to them now? The suspects, I mean. What's left for them after all this? Poirot's gaze softened. They will live with their choices, just as we all do. Eleanor Varnum will carry the weight of her actions, the knowledge that her desire for control led to her husband's death. Montgomery will live with the guilt of what he did, the fear of losing everything that drove him to commit murder. And Linda Richards will have to live with the knowledge that her love, her misguided love, led her down a path she could never return from. Jap looked up, meeting Poirot's gaze. Do you think they'll ever really understand what they did? Poirot paused, his eyes distant as he reflected on the question. Perhaps. But understanding, Jap, is not always the same as redemption. Sometimes people make choices because they do not know any better. But once the truth is revealed, once they understand the consequences of their actions, the burden becomes heavier, and some will never be able to forgive themselves. The room fell into a heavy silence. Neither man spoke, each lost in their thoughts, each reflecting on the toll the case had taken, not just on the criminals, but on everyone involved. For Poirot, the truth was always the key, but even the truth he had come to realize could never fully unravel the emotional complexity of the human heart. I've seen a lot of cases, Poirot, Jap said finally, breaking the silence, but I don't think I'll ever forget this one. There's something about it, something that just sticks with you. Poirot nodded. Indeed. This case will stay with me as well, but that is the nature of our work, Jap. We solve the mysteries, but we are never fully free of them. They linger like shadows in the corners of our minds. But that is what makes us who we are. It is what makes us human. Jap looked at Poirot, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You've always got away with words, Poirot. I suppose that's why you're the detective, and I'm just the cop. Poirot returned the smile, though it was tinged with a sadness that mirrored Jap's own. It is not about words, Jap. It is about understanding, and perhaps, in the end, that is what truly makes a difference. The two men sat in silence for a long moment, each lost in their thoughts. The case of James Varnum had come to its end. The criminals were convicted, the mystery was solved, but the true cost of their actions could never be fully accounted for. And as Poirot looked out the window at the sprawling city below, he knew that the world would continue to turn, that new cases would arise and new mysteries would unfold. But some things, he realized, would always remain beyond the reach of even the most brilliant of minds. For now, Poirot could rest, knowing that the truth had been revealed. But the emotional weight of the case would remain with him, just as it would remain with the criminals who had thought they could escape their fate. In the end, the truth always found a way to come to light. But the consequences of that truth, those were the things that lingered. And for Hercule Poirot, that was the most difficult part of all. The evening was quiet, the last whispers of daylight slipping away as the city outside seemed to continue in its perpetual motion, oblivious to the resolution of the mystery that had unfolded within the walls of Poirot's apartment. It had been a long journey, a case woven with contradictions, buried truths, and a tangle of emotions. The case of James Varnum had been solved, the criminals exposed, and the truth laid bare. Yet, as Poirot sat at his desk, reviewing the final details, there was no great sense of satisfaction, no burst of triumph. There was only the soft hum of the world continuing to turn. For Hercule Poirot, there were no neatly wrapped conclusions, no moments of dramatic revelation that brought a sense of closure. His mind was always sharp, but it was also deeply attuned to the subtleties of human nature, to the emotions that governed every action and every decision. And in this case, the human cost had been far greater than any legal retribution could ever address. The suspects, Eleanor Varnum, Charles Montgomery, and Linda Richards, had been sentenced. They had faced justice, and they would serve their time. But Poirot knew that the punishment, the trials, and the prison sentences would never truly answer the questions that lingered in the hearts of those involved. No verdict could erase the guilt that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. And for Varnum, the tragedy was not only in his untimely death, but in the way his life had been undone by the very fears he had tried to avoid. Poirot had found the truth, and yet there was no sense of completion. He had exposed the lies, unraveled the motives, and pieced together the fractured pieces of the story. And yet, as he sat in his apartment that night, the emotional toll of the case weighed on him more than the intellectual triumph. The case had ended, but the consequences, the emotional scars, would remain. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was soft, deliberate, the kind of knock one would make if they had already spent time contemplating the meaning of their visit. Poirot stood, moving with his characteristic precision, and opened the door. It was Chief Inspector Japp, his face drawn with fatigue, but with a faint glimmer of something else in his eyes. Perhaps a sense of understanding, or simply the weariness of one who has seen too many cases like this. "Poirot," Japp said softly as he stepped inside. "I wanted to thank you for everything. You were right, as always. The criminals have been caught. The case is closed." Poirot smiled faintly, though his heart was not in it. "Yes, the case is closed. But the truth is more than just the facts, Japp. It is more than just the crime and the punishment." Japp nodded, his gaze shifting to the window, where the last of the daylight had faded and the shadows of the night crept in. "I've been thinking about that too. You know, Poirot, there's no real satisfaction in these cases, is there? We solve them, bring the criminals to justice, but there's always a price to pay. And sometimes I wonder if it's ever really worth it." Poirot looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps, Japp, it is not about whether it is worth it. It is simply about doing what must be done. The criminals are punished, the truth is revealed, but the emotional toll, the consequences, that remains. For everyone involved." Japp turned back to him, his face pensive. "I get what you mean. I've seen it too many times. The law does its job, but there's always a human cost. Some things can't be fixed with a conviction or a sentence." Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "Yes, Japp. That is what makes our work both necessary and troubling." We uncover the truth, but we cannot change what has already been done. We cannot undo the damage caused by the choices people make. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of their words hanging heavy between them. Poirot's gaze moved to the desk where the case files lay, completed and neatly stacked. He had solved the mystery. The criminals were behind bars, the truth revealed, but the consequences, those would endure far longer than any sentence. "Perhaps that is why I continue, Jap," Poirot said softly, his voice tinged with something almost wistful. "Not for the satisfaction of solving the case, but for the need to understand, to make sense of the chaos. The truth is never simple. It is always tangled with motives, emotions, and fears. And it is these things, Jap, that make our work meaningful. Because in the end, it is not just about bringing criminals to justice. It is about understanding why they did what they did." Jap seemed to absorb this, his expression softening. "You've always said that, Poirot, that it's not just about the crime, but about the people behind it. I think you're right." Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It is the people who drive the crime, Jap, the human nature beneath it all, and it is only by understanding that, by understanding the complexities of the heart and the mind, that we can ever truly solve a case." Jap exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the case had finally caught up with him. "Well, Poirot, I'll leave you to your thoughts. I just wanted to let you know that everything's been wrapped up. The case is officially closed." Poirot nodded, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "Thank you, Jap. You've been a great help, as always. But I think for now, I must take my leave from this case. The truth has been revealed, and that is all I can do." Jap lingered for a moment longer before heading for the door. "I'll see you later, Poirot. And if you ever need me, you know where to find me." Poirot watched him go, and as the door clicked shut behind him, he turned back to the desk. The case was over. The suspects were convicted. The truth had been revealed, and yet, as Poirot sat alone in his apartment, the shadows of the past still loomed large in his mind. He had solved the mystery, yes. But in his heart, he knew that the emotional cost of this case would never truly fade. The consequences would remain etched into the lives of those involved. And that, Poirot understood, was the true burden of justice. The truth had come to light, and in doing so, it had torn open the lives of those who thought they could escape its reach. But as Poirot had always known, the truth could never be hidden forever. It had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep the lies were buried. With that final thought, Poirot stood up, his mind now at peace. The case was over, but the lessons he had learned would stay with him, just as they had stayed with him after every case he had ever solved. There would always be another mystery, another challenge. But for now, the truth had been revealed, and that was enough. Poirot walked over to the window and looked out at the city below. The world was vast, and its mysteries were endless. But for the moment, Hercule Poirot could rest easy. The case of James Varnum, the man who never took the train, was finally closed.